but it's a good explanation. It's a good illustration of the fact that what we accept as commonplace isn't commonplace for everyone.
Mhm.
And so, but one of the other things, and this is a really, I thought, a brilliant observation. It's from Robert D. Nelson. He cited in Ellen White's article, and he says the plurality of shrines, speaking of the shrines to Baal, inevitably reflected the local multiplicity of Canaanite Baal worship, implying a Yahweh of Dan and a Yahweh of Bethel. So what he's saying here is, if there were multiple locations to worship God, there would very easily could have uh, become this idea that there were multiple Yahwehs. And if you study Canaanite mythology, one of the really kind of interesting things that happens, and this is a gross oversimplification, so just I'm using it for illustrative purposes, that each region who worshiped Baal basically focused on the elements and attributes of Baal's in his stories that best suited their particular need and culture. So by doing this, they obscured some of the other aspects and essentially created a new Baal, even though some of the primary and foundational elements of the mythos would be intact. The details were often different, and this resulted in some even conflicting stories of the Baal saga. And by God saying, "Hey, no, you're gonna worship me at one place," he really denied the chance for there to be this manipulation and this massaging of his story in order to serve the people, because each of these Baals, as they're created in the image of the worshiper. They reflect the needs and the wants of the worshiper rather than the God as originally described. So God just totally rules it out from the beginning. And I'm like, that's a really good point, because I would have never thought of that. I mean,
Mhm.
for us, the idea that you can worship, you know, we're in small town Oklahoma. We grew up in in a house in a city where there's 600 people. There's 8 different churches. So the idea that you can worship God everywhere, yeah, that's commonplace to us, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But that that was not the way it was, and there was a reason behind it, and it's not oppressive. It's not an
Mhm.
oppressive reason. It is actually has a lot of significance to it. So, moving on. Verse 3. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. Okay, so very first thing out of the gate, it's interesting. Solomon loves the Lord. He doesn't fear God. When you go back in the previous stories, almost everything that you read is people fearing God. So Solomon loves him. I think that's a very interesting observation. Uh, then we need to understand what love means in a scriptural context,
Mhm.
because let's just face it, our Western ideas of love are completely messed up and all over the place and often have very little to do with actual love. A lot of lust, but not love. But I won't go down that rabbit trail. Now, J. DeVries makes a note in regards to the love of a deity. It implies a moral concern and commitment rather than mere affection. And then what he does is he goes back to Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy talks about God's love in several, or the love for God in several different places. And he pulls verses to illustrate. And I'm just going to read a couple because I think you're going to see this what's being going on here very easily. It says Deuteronomy 10:12. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Deuteronomy 30:16. If you obey the commandment of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, and it continues from there. Deuteronomy 30:20 says, "Love the Lord your God, obeying his voice, holding fast to him, for he is your life and the length of days." So to love the Lord in scripture always results in action. It's in obedience to his word as it's been given to you, which is some interesting implications for New Testament teachings where we just say,
Like
go ahead.
it's like James was onto something.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not just having an affection for God or even gratitude for God or even an awe for God. Are you going to obey him? Are you going to listen to what he says? So I think too often we've made it so simple, and I say simple kind of facetiously. Um, the idea of loving God is just to kind of be on friendly terms with it, the idea of God, but not to really worry about doing the things that foster that relationship. So when the writers of Kings says, "Hey, Solomon loved the Lord," he's saying God Solomon obeyed the Lord. That this is beyond, like you said, just that affection. And what's interesting is that we have, which is say sorry, which is interesting because we do have this on the heels of these very problematic issues of the marriage to Pharaoh's daughter and the fact that he's worshiping in the high place. And it says that, he walks in the statutes of David his father. Um, David told us what his statutes were. We don't have to guess at what they were. And if you remember back when we talked about the end of Second Samuel, and there's that chiasm in those last four chapters, and the chiasms come down to this psalm that David wrote, and within the psalm that David wrote, and which is another chiasm, he gives us his explanation of his statutes. And this is what David says, and this is 2 Samuel 22, starting in verse 21. The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands, he rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and I have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his rules were before me. From his statutes I did not turn aside. I was blameless before him. I kept myself from guilt, and the Lord, excuse me, rewarded me according to the righteousness and the cleanness of my hands. So
Mhm.
David's statutes were God's statutes. And this is the reason why, whenever we're talking about the weightiest commandment in all of the Torah, it's to honor your mother and father. Because if you honor your mother and father, who were presumably raised you up in the Jewish faith, you were also honoring God. So there's no distinction there. And now the verse says he made sacrifices in the high places, or made offerings in the high places. And the rabbis attempt again to reconcile this idea of Solomon making offerings in the high places, which is later forbidden, and with the fact that he is loving the Lord and following David's statute. And because there seems to be a conflict here. And so they offer a slightly little more tortured translation of the verse. They translate the only with more of the inflection of, or they don't really translate, they interpret it. It's not a translation, it's how they say you should read it, which becomes an interpretation. Uh,
Mhm.
only or except, unlike David his father, he sacrificed in his high place. And they make the claim that David did not sacrifice in high places, which we'll talk about how they get there when we get into verse 4, which we're going into. So Solomon goes to Gibeon in verse 4 to a great high place and offers up 1,000 burnt offerings. And we've already encountered Gibeon in several different places. And we first encountered Gibeon in Joshua 9. That's when the Gibeonites hear that Israel is coming to Canaan and they hear about the victory in Jericho. And they're like, we don't want that to be us. So they pretend that they're foreigners traveling through the land and they make an alliance with Joshua. And then when Joshua finds out that he was tricked, then the Gibeonites are put into slavery to perform the more mundane task around the temple, not the sacred duties, but chopping firewood, hauling water, that sort of thing. And so that's where we first encounter the Gibeonites is with this act of deception.
Mhm.
Then in Joshua 2, Gibeon is the location where I don't think that's Joshua 2. I think I've got the wrong verse. I think it's Joshua 10. Anyway, Gibeon's the location where the sun stands still during the
Mhm.
battle.
Mhm.
And in Joshua 18, we find out that the city of Gibeon is given to the tribe of Benjamin. So when Solomon goes to Gibeon, rather than sacrificing in Jerusalem, he's actually making a very important political statement. He's saying Benjamin is still a part of Israel. They weren't just rejected just because their family is no longer in power, that they've lost the kingship, and they've also lost the Ark of the Covenant, which is now in Jerusalem. So the symbol for God's presence and the place to worship is now outside of the Benjaminite territory and in Jerusalem in the territory of Judah. So this is kind of a statement that yes, you're still a part of the country, you're still a part of the nation, and I still recognize your significance. The next time we encounter Gibeon, this is in 2 Samuel 2 at the pool of Gibeon, and that's where Joab faces off with Abner, and Asahel, his brother, is killed, which leads to Joab killing Abner later on. The next time we encounter Gibeon, it's in 2 Samuel 20, and this is where Joab kills Amasa when David had replaced Joab as general and put Amasa in his place. And so, with the fact that Gibeon's in the tribe of Benjamin territory, Solomon could say, "Hey, I'm addressing the schism in the nation." And the fact that he is going to this place where Joab, who has done all these acts of violence, where they were actually committed, di Solomon could be saying, "I'm dealing with the schism in my own house," because you need to remember that Amasa was, Joab's cousin, and both Joab and Amasa were David's nephew. So, Solomon may be making some very pointed statements by choosing to worship here is his first public act of worship as a king. And the reason why I wonder, well, not the reason why I wonder this. I'm sorry, I was jumping on notes, but I do have some speculation because the fact that we've got two instances where Joab had committed, these acts of violence, murdering members of his family and his countrymen, that I have to wonder if Solomon's also addressing some of the fallout from Joab specifically, from Joab's actions specifically, because if you remember back in the previous chapter of First Kings, uh, chapter 2, verse 33, this is what Solomon says to Benaiah about Joab. He says, so shall their blood guilt, that's Abner and Amasa, come back on the head of Joab and the head of his descendants forever. But for David and his descendants, and for his house and for his throne, there shall be peace from the Lord forever." So I have to wonder if that's not part of what Solomon's trying to address here too. That as as I reunify both my family and the nation, it's going to come through this act of unity with God. So the next time we encounter Gibeon actually is also, I think, very informative because the Gibeonites are identified as the source or the reason for the 3-year famine at the end of David's reign. And if you remember in 2 Samuel 21, we find that Saul had somehow wronged the Gibeonites. It may have gone back to that slaughter of the priest at Nob. That was one of the speculation that we threw out there. Uh, but it wasn't until David enacted some hardcore A&E justice and turned over 7 of Saul's sons to be hung, uh, that the famine was released. So this is the place where Solomon chooses to go, and I think there's a lot of significance there because we do see so many acts of violence, so much wrong, and so much justice that has either been remiss or not enacted until Solomon takes his place as the king or until the end of David's reign. So I think there's more to it than just, oh, well, this is where everybody goes to worship. Solomon's too savvy, he's too politically aware to do something just by rote. So we're also told that Solomon offers 1,000 burnt offerings. Um, Now, a burnt offering is unique because number one, it is an offering, it's not a sacrifice. And so a sacrifice is something that's required, an offering is just something that's given. It's more of a gift, is a better way of thinking about it. Uh, Also, offerings, are completely consumed. That where a sacrifice, part of what is offered is given back to the one who making the sacrifice to enjoy a feast with the priest and his family. And because this is an offering that is completely consumed, it's burned up in the fire and the it goes up in smoke, it's also called an ascent offering because it all goes to heaven. And this type of offering is first described in Leviticus 1, and the procedures and the purpose are described. So I'm just going to read verse 4 because that's the important part for what we're discussing. It says, "He, the person making the offering, shall lay his hand on the burnt offering, and it